Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Thanks for downloading this edition of The Why Factor from the BBC World Service. This is the programme that seeks to find out why we do the things we do. I hope you enjoy it.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Dave, if I just really feel like if we had liberty it would be terrific and the alternative would just be awful, you know?
A journalist at the Washington Post imagines famous speeches made by men.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
I'm sorry, Mikhail, if I could just... Didn't mean to cut you off there. Can we agree that this wall maybe isn't quite doing what it should be doing?
The way a woman would say them in a business meeting.
I came, I saw, I conquered.
I don't want to blow my own trumpet here at all, but I definitely have been to those places and was just honoured to be part of it as our team did such a wonderful job of conquering them.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Catherine Carr, and today on The Why Factor, why do men and women speak a different language? Or do they?
Hello, this is Kit Welchland, and welcome to Welchland.com. Today's video blog is on gender communication.
Go online and you'll find a plethora of advice on how to speak at work.
So this is the bottom line when it comes to the different language between men and women. Men, knock off the cussing and the swearing. Women, drop the qualifiers and hedges to be more assertive and confident.
So, women, don't apologise too much and don't use the words just or actually, as in, I'd just like to say that actually I think you're wrong. Tara Moore is author of Playing Big, Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create and Lead. She coaches women on leadership and well-being.
What happens is that for girls and women, we are socialized to communicate in a certain way, to not rock the boat, to make sure that we're always coming across as likable.
Her writing partially inspired the creation of an online tool that highlights apologetic or unassertive language in emails. Women are then encouraged to delete the offending phrases. It's certainly a widely held belief that men and women use different language. And those of us who remember the 1990s may well have read Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, a landmark American book about relationships, which is based on the idea that men and women communicate differently.
You see, complaining is a part of life. Women are big complainers. But if you complain to a man about him, he can't hear. He can't hear. No man can hear. The most masculine thing, the most testosterone-producing thing a man can do is actually to be silent and listen. And for a woman, the most feminine thing she can do is to express how she feels.
Author of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, John Gray. In 2014, the haircare product Pantene launched an advert showing women saying sorry, again and again.
Sorry, can I ask a stupid question?
Sorry, do you have a minute?
Sorry.
The advert opens with the question, why are women always apologising? I'm sorry, are we?
There is a lot of pressure on people to speak in ways that are appropriate to the society they live in, and one of those things is pressures on men to talk like men and women to talk like women.
Janet Holmes is a linguist based at Wellington University in New Zealand. She set up the Language in the Workplace project to record and study how people interact and communicate at work. It's been analysing data for 21 years, using more than 30 workplaces and over 2,000 conversations. According to Janet, the stereotype of how women are expected to speak is
facilitative behaviours, so women tend to encourage people to join in the conversation. They give supportive feedback. They say and yeah a lot.
Saying things like kind of or sort of or maybe or possibly. And I know you're awfully busy, but, or I'm sorry to bother you, however. I hope...
And for men, it's
competitive. It tends to be aggressive. They interrupt each other, confrontational. They're very direct.
Avoid. Your grandson, they didn't stop them coming in. Right.
20 years ago, when I began research on language and gender, there was a predominant pattern of looking at men do this and women do that. And Once we started actually looking at what men and women did and the way people speak, we found it was much more complicated, and that both men and women drew on aspects of language use that were regarded as stereotypically feminine or stereotypically masculine, depending on the context in which they found themselves.
This finding is backed up by extensive research done by the linguist Deborah Cameron at Oxford University in the UK. She studied language and gender since the 1980s and is author of several books on the subject, including The Myth of Mars and Venus.
There are not many clear-cut differences between men and women. You can't really generalise. So there's as much difference among men or among women as there is between the two.
So why are these ideas about male and female speech so prevalent? Deborah believes these myths persist in part due to what psychologists call confirmation bias.
You notice what you're expecting to see, and you often don't notice what you're not expecting to see or what goes against your expectations. So, your perceptions kind of confirm your view of the world, and they may not actually be accurate about the behaviour that you're responding to.
When you started your work in this area, did you find that there was quite a number of myths, perhaps, or beliefs or stereotypes that you had to sort of battle through and evaluate?
Yes. This is something that pretty much all cultures that have ever been studied have stereotypes and beliefs about. So, for instance, there are cultures where people will say, women are really much more direct than men. They're too direct. Whereas, of course, in most of what you might call the West, the developed West, the stereotype is exactly the other way around. Women are timid, women are diplomatic, women are more indirect.
I'm interested to know where that place is.
Well, for example, in the Malagasy Republic, people will tell you that only men master the very, very indirect style of speech that's considered to be prestigious and valuable. Women are left to do things like market trading, for instance, where you do need to be quite direct about things like how much does it cost.
So what I'm taking away from that is that no matter where you are in the world and no matter which style of communication you choose as a woman, you're constantly judged for it against some kind of measure.
Yes, the one thing you can say is universal is that whatever women are thought to do is valued less highly than what men are thought to do.
So are there really no differences in the way men and women use language?
The only thing that we can really say that has been borne out by research again and again is the tendency for men to dominate in terms of talking more. This has been documented in so many contexts, in marital conversations, but also in discussions that are more kind of public or formal, so workplace or political.
Donald thinks that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. I think it's real. Science is real.
I do not say that.
And I think it's important that it did collapse.
That's called business, by the way.
9 million. It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
There was a study done by two political scientists in the United States in a lab study where they got people and put them in groups and asked them to deliberate on a political question. It was about the allocation of resources. And they varied the gender balance. So they had everything from 1 woman with 4 men to 4 women with 1 man. And they found that women didn't get their fair share of the conversational time until they were not only a majority but a super majority. They had to outnumber the man 4-1 before they were getting their proper proportion of the time.
Janet Holmes's research also found a small difference in the content of some male bosses' speech.
The men tended, in our data, to tell the hero stories. So from the very effective leaders in several of the male organisations, and the organisations which had a male leader, we would have a story of how they'd been very successful in transforming the organisation, in restructuring it, in saving it from catastrophe in one case, and doubtless true. But we tended to find that the women's stories tended to be stories about funny things that had happened to them, or they tended to be about self-deprecating stories about mistakes they'd made or things that had gone wrong.
So far, we've talked mostly about the linguistic behaviour in English, and the Malagasy Republic. And we've learnt that in English, differences in language are really a matter of social expectation and perception. But what about other languages? Are there formal differences?
My name is Bjarke Frellesvik. I'm a professor of Japanese linguistics at the University of Oxford in England, in the UK. Japanese has a set of particles that are tacked onto the end of a sentence, so it could liken that to saying you know or you see. So you can express insistence on what you're saying, or you can express hedging about what you're saying in that way. One is wa, which can come at the end of an utterance, or the particle kashira, which means I wonder. And both of those are said to be used exclusively by women and are also said to be expressions of feminine language. There are other particles like zo or ze, which are said to never be used by women, but only to be used by men. So that is one area in which these gender differences in usage are codified in the grammar of the language. Another area is in words that refer to you and me, and some of these words are said to be used exclusively by women, and some of them are said to be used exclusively by men.
I noticed when you were talking about the different bits of grammar that are codified, you said they are said to be used by men and said to be used by women. Does that mean that in practice men and women are free to borrow from the sort of grammatical parts of the language which are said to belong to the other gender?
You're absolutely right. These ideas about gendered language in Japan are very much a stereotype. It's very much a usage that we find in fiction, it's usage that we find in language textbooks, and it's not to the same extent usage that we find in actual speech spoken by individuals.
So if I was to go out today and buy a textbook to try and learn Japanese, I'd be taught I should use particular phrases and styles of speech, because I'm a woman. But in practice, that's not how real Japanese women speak. This somewhat confusing situation is in part down to Japan's turbulent history.
Japan was isolated from much of the rest of the world for quite a long period, from about the beginning of the 17th century, from maybe the 1630s onwards, up until the middle of the 19th century, when pressure from European countries and from America, who wanted to trade with Japan, became so strong that they were forced to open up the country again to the outside world. So having lived in this self-imposed bubble for close to 250 years, there was a lot of catching up to do.
That opening up led to a massive modernisation project, which included the creation of a standardised national language.
At the start, when in the 1860s and 70s universal education was introduced, girls apparently spoke no differently from boys, and they actually dressed no differently from boys, and that attracted a great deal of criticism because they were seen to be vulgar, rude, outgoing, and probably as a counter-reaction to that, among some schoolgirls, especially in Tokyo, a distinct way of speaking was evolved and was probably to some extent consciously created.
The schoolgirl speech Bjarke describes was not seen as refined or elegant. In fact, quite the reverse.
It was a negative marker. Characters who were using it in fiction were not positive role models in any way.
Were they the naughty ones?
They were the naughty ones, yeah.
I think that's what you're getting at.
But actually that is very true, and there's even several pieces of pornography from the time where the girls would use that kind of language also when they were engaged in intimate acts. If we then fast forward to the 1920s and 30s and 40s, when things had changed a lot in Japan. Japan had become militaristic, very nationalistic. At that time, the idea also won forth that there should be a feminine, elegant way of speaking. And what's very interesting in that context, I think, is that the linguistic features they chose were exactly those forms that the schoolgirls in the 1870s, 80s and 90s were criticized for using.
What's coming through all the examples we've talked about is that social expectations of how women should behave are deeply ingrained and can have a huge impact on behaviour.
Women in sub-Saharan Africa are expected to be silent.
Lilium Lematanga is the author of Gender and Language in Sub-Saharan Africa. She now lectures on the subject at the University of Dashang in Cameroon. A lot of her work has focused on the use of language in the Cameroonian parliament.
My research on parliamentary data indicated that men speak a lot more in terms of quantity of talk and a lot more in terms of the variety of topics that they draw on. And when women tended to speak like men, as in being vocal, challenging, the men frowned at these women and even boo at her. For example, in a situation where a woman was criticizing men for raping women in prison, the Speaker of the House of Parliament told the woman that, I would tell your husband, does your husband know that you speak like this in public? Does your husband know that you talk a lot and that you challenge men? So I find that in public, when women tend to talk a lot and be more critical, they are generally frowned on, not only by men, but also by women.
So linguistic studies suggest the sexes are roughly the same when it comes to the variety and styles of language they use. The really big difference seems to lie in the way women are perceived for using stereotypically male language. Linguist Deborah Cameron again.
There is a social cost and there's research which shows that. For instance, there was a study done of the performance evaluations given to women managers in the tech industry and men managers in the tech industry, and it found very strikingly that a high percentage of the women and an extremely low percentage of the men did get criticisms about their manner being too abrasive. That word abrasive recurred in these evaluations. So, being assertive has costs, and we also know from other studies that there is this thing which psychologists call the competence likability problem, that the more competent a woman is seen to be, a woman who is judged competent in the same way as a man, will be seen as less likable than he is.
You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you do.
Exactly so.
Yeah.
So I think what's actually going on here is, to be honest, sexism.
So how do women at the very top of their profession navigate this competence versus likability problem?
My name's Nicola Mendelsohn and I'm the Vice President of Facebook for Europe, the Middle East and Africa.
Nicola Mendelsohn is one of the most senior women in an industry, technology, that is heavily dominated by men. She describes her own style of communication as
pretty open, pretty concise, pretty clear.
So have words like abrasive ever been used about her?
I'm sure they have, but probably not to my face. No, that's not true. They have been used to my face. I've been given that feedback at different times.
What do you think about it?
To be honest, I didn't think about it a lot when I was younger in my career. Somebody gave me that sort of feedback and I thought, well, that must be true then, mustn't it? But actually, as I've got older, I've learned that those are words that sometimes are used differently for men and for women. And for women, they're usually used in a negative way. Whereas for men, they're usually used weirdly in a positive way. So I see that's an example of bias.
The type of bias that Nicola's seen in her own career reflects what Deborah Cameron has said about men tending to hog the airtime when it comes to group discussions.
I remember earlier on in my career that sometimes I would have the thought in my head, but I lacked the confidence to be able to get that thought out. And then I would hear usually a man say the point that I had in my head, and I'd kick myself because I knew that. Why didn't I say that? I just lacked the confidence.
Do you think that's a particularly female problem in your experience of leading large companies? You must have mentored and managed a lot of women. Is that something that you hear?
Yes, I do. I think I see that a lot, and I think there's reason for that. I think one of the characteristics that you see, and I still sadly do see this in business, is that women get interrupted a lot, or people talk over them when they're making a point of view, and then often a colleague will re-say that point of view a few minutes later and take the credit for it. So I think there is an element that happens in the workplace where we actually condition women to not speak. I mean, I had it recently. I was in, outside of Facebook, I was in a business meeting and there were about 15, 20 people in the room, 2 senior female business leaders. And they were making points, and there were a couple of men in the room that kept speaking over them. They just kept interrupting them, kept speaking over them. And it actually got so ludicrous that some of the men in the room, if you like, became the allies and went, hang on a minute, can you just let them finish, let them get the points out? So the reason I share that story is because that's a room of senior people. So you can imagine some of the challenges that younger women face as they're coming up through their careers. It's difficult.
You may be thinking, what should I do with all of this information? Nicola Mendelsohn says in the world of business, all individuals, including men, need to combat bias in the workplace.
I think within organisations, I think we should be promoting more relatable role models. You know, the research that we did showed us that less than a third of women in the UK can think of a business role model that inspires them. So I think that's an area that we can think about in businesses. We can think about celebrating the women that are coming through, the female leaders coming through at all different levels.
And leadership coach Tara Moore says we should all think carefully about the language we use.
Have you used the word abrasive in a performance review of a woman? That's a term we really only use with women. Let's not use that term anymore. Are you critiquing someone's communication style just because it feels uncomfortable to you? Everyone in the company, men and women, need to be having their awareness raised around those dynamics so that women don't have to deal with this very unfair reality.
But Deborah Cameron says beware of some of the advice out there.
The advice that you see in sort of business magazines or women's magazines about why you shouldn't apologise, why you shouldn't say just, which is a kind of what linguists call hedging, making something less forceful. The reasons given for that are really very, very simplistic. So, for example, anyone who's looked carefully at how apologies work in English is not going to draw the conclusion that they're always a way of taking blame upon yourself. They are often a way of showing consideration for the other person. You're not saying, I did something wrong. You're saying, I realise I might be imposing on you and I want to display to you that I care about that. And it's a similar thing with just, can I just ask you a question doesn't mean, oh, I'm a humble little thing who has no right to ask anything. It means I'm intruding upon you, and so I'm going to kind of embed in the way I express that a signal that I know I'm imposing and that I want to persuade you to cooperate with me. So it's strategic.
I'm Catherine Carr, and you've been listening to The Y Factor. The producer was China Collins, and you can listen again to this programme on the website and hear other Y Factors on a range of fascinating topics, including serial killers, imposter syndrome and surrogacy. We'd also love to hear your ideas for future topics. Email us at yfactor@bbc.com. The very final word on today's programme goes to Oxford University linguist Deborah Cameron.
There's this whole idea that women over-apologise, and I think that's very telling as a phrase. Over-apologise in comparison to what? And the implication is men. But why exactly is their behaviour a benchmark?
Thanks for listening to The Y Factor. If you're on the hunt for other quality podcasts, then I'd recommend 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy, also from the BBC World Service. Just search for it on iTunes or your podcast provider.